explore the profound possibility that the Knights Templars' true objective extended beyond territorial conquest. Consider whether Jerusalem symbolized a deeper spiritual battle, not for earthly dominion or material wealth, but for the very essence of human spirit. Envision the entire order, from their enigmatic pledges to their ultimate demise, as a silent homily delivered to the disheartened, a clandestine doctrine intended for those who had lost conviction. Ponder the notion that this ancient message, long concealed, might hold relevance for contemporary individuals. Take a moment to alleviate your burdens. Allow the tranquility of the evening to envelop you. The profound insights you seek are not inscribed in monumental stone, but rather emerge subtly, like whispers carried through ancient catacombs in the flickering glow of candlelight. Should your conviction falter, know that you are not isolated in this experience. This evening, we shall trace the legacy of individuals whose unwavering belief compelled them to make the ultimate sacrifice. The narratives of knights adorned in white mantles, their chests emblazoned with crimson crosses, valiantly charging into conflict with drawn swords and unwavering spiritual resolve, are undoubtedly familiar. You have observed their depictions in art, statuary, and the decaying architectural remnants that once bore their distinctive emblem. Yet, beneath their martial exterior and beyond the embellished tales, an entirely different fervor resonated within them, a profound aspiration, not for combat, but for spiritual elevation and transcendence. The designation, poor fellow soldiers of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon itself, evokes an enigma. Neither entirely monastic nor purely martial, they were refined in the crucible of the Crusades. However, deeper examination reveals an increasingly complex and unusual history. Their inception remains nebulous, their practices cloaked in secrecy, and their demise cataclysmic. Throughout these historical phases, a consistent and compelling theme emerges: the suggestion that the Templars' ultimate purpose was not territorial acquisition, but a form of spiritual reclamation. This conversion was arguably directed not at non-believers, but towards those who had already strayed from their spiritual path. Is it conceivable that the Templars did not seek to establish an empire, but rather to construct a spiritual sanctuary for individuals grappling with profound skepticism? If this hypothesis holds true, their narrative is far from concluded. It merely awaits rediscovery by those most receptive to its profound implications. To ensure you do not miss subsequent insights into these historical enigmas, kindly consider subscribing. You journey into the intense atmosphere of the Holy Land, not as a casual observer or a combatant, but as an ethereal presence pursuing a millennium-old rumor. The year is 1119. The inaugural crusade has concluded, and Jerusalem has been re-established under Christian rule. Nevertheless, the routes traversed by pilgrims to the revered sites continue to be perilous, fraught with bandits, raiders, and worse. Into this precarious environment steps a contingent of 9 men, neither monarchs nor military leaders, but something distinctly more unconventional. Their declared objective is to safeguard travelers. Their actual intentions are considerably more ambiguous. They possess minimal armament, often ride 2 to a single horse, abstain from marriage, lay no claim to land, and commit to vows of poverty akin to monks. Despite this, they choose not to reside in a traditional monastery. Instead, they establish themselves within the venerable ruins of the Temple of Solomon, a structure more embedded in legend than in tangible history, its stones echoing with ancient lore and spiritual yearning by the 12th century. If their role was solely that of security personnel, why select a location imbued with apocalyptic prophecy? This serves as the initial indicator that the Templars were not precisely as they presented themselves, or rather, they were exactly who they claimed to be. But the broader world entirely misconstrued their profound meaning. Protecting pilgrims offered a convenient truth, granting them purpose and public approbation. Yet, beneath this public mandate lay a far more profound objective. Perhaps they were not merely safeguarding travelers. They might have been protecting something concealed, or conceivably, they were engaged in a process of discovery. One extensively documented yet frequently disregarded fact is that the Templars dedicated their initial 9 years in the Holy Land not to patrolling roads, but to dwelling almost exclusively beneath the Temple Mount. Records, though sparse and peculiar, detail their excavations. They left no official logs, no maps, nor any explanations. However, the area they occupied was no ordinary shelter. It was sacred ground, widely believed to house relics, ancient scrolls, and even wisdom preserved since the era of Solomon himself. Here, a contentious hypothesis begins to unfold. Some historians propose that the Templars were not established to serve the ecclesiastical hierarchy, but rather to unearth truths that the Church had long suppressed. One theory suggests that their founders were connected to esoteric traditions, potentially remnants of early Christian factions, perhaps even Gnostic in their philosophical orientation. If this holds true, their presence at the Temple Mount was not about strategic advantage, but about profound spiritual revelation. Within this realm of speculation resides one peculiar historical consistency. Following those 9 years of silence in Jerusalem, the Templars returned to Europe and experienced an explosive expansion. They garnered royal endorsements, papal recognition, immense wealth, extensive landholdings, influence, and maintained profound secrecy. They transformed from a small group of obscure knights into a dominant international force. The timing of this ascent is remarkably uncanny. It is as if they discovered or learned something that rendered them indispensable, yet they meticulously kept it concealed. They refrained from overt proselytization, avoided forced recruitment, and declined to explicate their organizational structure. The majority of their members never even journeyed to the Holy Land. They operated more akin to a clandestine spiritual circuit than a conventional military order. Whatever their core beliefs, they were not intended for public dissemination. Modern academics have meticulously examined the limited surviving documentation, including the Latin Rule, drafted with the assistance of Bernard of Clairvaux. While the text delineates their conduct, prohibiting personal property, idle discourse, and extravagant attire, it also alludes to a more profound spiritual framework. The order exhibited an intense preoccupation with internal purity, discretion, and mystical discipline. Their engagements in combat were described as purgative, and their suffering as redemptive. Furthermore, there is the intriguing issue of relics. The Templars collected them, at times exchanged them, and frequently safeguarded them at considerable expense. Yet, they never appeared to exploit them for profit or public display. Unlike other knightly orders that ostentatiously exhibited sacred bones and fragments of the cross to galvanize followers, the Templars maintained their treasures in secrecy, almost as if hoarding them. Why this approach? One obscure 13th century chronicle hints that a select group within the order believed these relics were not merely objects of veneration, but instruments, potentially even keys. The phrasing is exasperatingly imprecise. They who held the fragment of the wood would speak prayers thrice bound, and in this would open the heart of God. What is the meaning of this statement? Was it metaphorical, or did it imply something more mystical or perilous? The deeper one investigates, the more apparent it becomes that the public-facing Templars, the crusading warriors, constituted merely an external facade. Within, a distinctly different crusade unfolded. One fought not with swords or banners, but with rituals, silence, and scriptures accessible to only a select few. It is worth reiterating that those 9 founding knights did not expand their membership for nearly a decade. This behavior deviates from the norm for an order established for defense. Most organizations with military objectives would scale up immediately. However, if their genuine mission involved study, secrecy, or something more metaphysical, their limited size becomes entirely logical. Consequently, the question persists. If Jerusalem merely served as the exterior framework, a mere stage setting, what constituted the inner sanctum? What knowledge or burden did they convey back to Europe? And why did it secure the favor of monarchs? Perhaps the answer lies not in what they physically discovered, but in what they fervently believed they had unearthed. A divine mandate originating not from popes or bishops, but from something far more ancient, something interred beneath centuries of silence, awaiting individuals audacious or devout enough to excavate it. The dust of the Holy Land adhered to their cloaks, but the unifying bond among them was not one of kinship, monetary gain, or even national allegiance. It was something more ancient, more delicate, akin to a vow whispered across generations. The 9 men who would become the Knights Templar were not predestined for their cause, they were called to it. And what they answered was not a battle trumpet's call, but something more subtle, more enigmatic, a spiritual resonance that subtly vibrated beneath the surface of their lives until, one day, it could no longer be disregarded. Modern historians often characterize the order as a military response to prevailing chaos. Yet beneath this surface, traces of another reality emerge, a clandestine society operating under the guise of a chivalric order. The initial members were not randomly chosen warriors. They were drawn from a select circle of French nobles with prior exposure to esoteric teachings, likely connected through Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot, who would become their formidable advocate. This connection is well attested. Clairvaux's own writings describe the order in spiritual terms more befitting monks than fighters, referring to them as soldiers of Christ, who fear not the flesh but the flame of the soul's damnation. Here lies the primary historical fact that complicates the conventional narrative. The Templars were profoundly contemplative. Prayer was not merely an embellishment, it was meticulously scheduled, ritualized, and indispensable. Their days were punctuated by periods of silence and scripture. Unlike other knights, they lived communally, slept fully clothed and armed, and frequently awoke before dawn for nocturnal devotions. These were not merely the habits of warriors, they were the practices of ascetics bearing swords. Yet, there exists an obscure and frequently overlooked 12th century document, the Times Occitania Memoranda Asterisk, which references a circle of the temple predating the formal recognition of the order. The text is fragmentary but tantalizing. It suggests that a group of men were already convening in secret to deliberate matters of spiritual warfare long before Pope Honorius II formally sanctioned the Knights Templar in 1129. If accurate, this situates the order's genesis not in necessity but in deliberate intent, the intentional creation of a brotherhood that seamlessly merged chivalry with mysticism. But why such profound secrecy? Why the imperative to obscure their spiritual objectives behind a military function? One theory, though contentious, proposes that the Templars originated from a sense of disillusionment. The First Crusade had starkly exposed the horrors and futility of holy war. What if these men, profoundly scarred by their observations, opted for a different course? Not one of conquest, but of redemption, achieved through arduous struggle, a spiritual militia armored not merely in steel, but in penitence. You may recall from earlier discussions that the order dedicated its initial years in Jerusalem not to expansion, but to tunneling beneath the Temple Mount. Their conduct was monastic, even obsessive. When combined with the clandestine formation of this brotherhood, a discernible pattern emerges. These were not improvisations, but carefully structured rites. The order's architecture was designed to eradicate ego and annihilate the individual self. A knight who joined the Templars relinquished his name, his inheritance, and even the right to speak without explicit permission. Why such extreme rigor? The answer may reside in a concept borrowed from early Christian martyrs. Asterisk, imitatio Christi. Asterisk, the imitation of Christ. However, in the Templar worldview, this imitation was not passive. It was forged in the crucible of fire and ash. They did not merely endure suffering, they actively trained for it and embraced it. Every hardship was interpreted as a spiritual refinement, a means to strip away the worldly facade and reveal the divine core. To perish in battle was not considered defeat. It was viewed as an act of ascension, Not all contemporaries concurred with this approach. Even in their own era, critics accused them of fanaticism. Whispers followed them, too secretive, too rigid, too intense. And here commences an open academic debate. Were the Templars proto-mystics preparing themselves for divine encounters? Or were they merely a well-armed cult descending into spiritual extremism? Some scholars refer to the writings of Alandil, who described certain knights as brides of Christ, bound to no altar but that of pain. Is this poetic expression or a stark warning? What kind of individuals perceive spiritual matrimony within suffering? And what kind of institution cultivates such a perspective? This inquiry directs us to the concept of Time's Templar asterisk, understood not merely as a physical edifice, but as a consecrated space set apart. In Roman antiquity, a Times Templum Times designated a sacred zone, an area demarcated for divine observation. If the Templars comprehended their own bodies, their very existences, as Times template, Times spaces, made sacred through discipline and ordeal, then their entire being becomes a continuous ceremony. Every action, every moment of silence, every wound, an offering. Here, the earlier observation becomes clearer. In Jerusalem, they were not excavating for gold. They were endeavoring to liberate themselves from sin. The brotherhood they established was not intended to alter the external world, but to redeem the world within. Consequently, the fires they ignited were not the flames of conquest, but of purification. They were not merely knights, they were living reliquaries, bearing not bones or parchments, but a lived gospel inscribed into their very flesh. One might find this amusing, yet somewhere deep within the archives of Portugal, a faded account persists. It describes a dying Templar whispering a final vow. "If I fall, let it be not for land, but for the soul of my brother." This sentiment resonates less with a warrior and more with a monk wielding a sword and intoning a psalm. And if their sword was tangible, if the blood they shed was real, then perhaps the wound they sought to heal was equally authentic, not in others, but within themselves. You have undoubtedly encountered rulebooks previously, volumes of ancient statutes, moral admonitions, and inflexible decrees meticulously crafted as manuals for guiding individuals deemed too recalcitrant for self-governance. Most such texts prove unengaging. Even sacred ones, after a few lines, merge into the monotonous drone of authoritative pronouncements. However, the Templar rule, the directive established to govern the order's daily existence, does not resemble a conventional rulebook. Instead, it reads more like a whispered instructional guide for profound transformation. Its official designation is the Latin Rule, formulated circa 1129 with the assistance of Bernard of Clairvaux. Ostensibly, it provides pragmatic directives, guidelines for eating, praying, and sleeping. It prohibits silk, frowns upon facial hair, and discourages idle conversation. Yet, when recited slowly and attentively in a quiet room, something more profound emerges. Beneath the ascetic counsel lies an unmistakable current of mystical intensity. An undeniable historical fact is that this rule became the spiritual bedrock of the order. It was not optional. It was not merely symbolic. Every Templar, from the most junior initiate to the seasoned commander, lived under its stringent clauses. Curiously, its tone is not one of mere command, but rather of conversion. It does not simply regulate behavior. It endeavors to reconfigure the very soul. One particular line resonates with a hidden urgency. "Let each man be a temple wherein dwelleth the fire of the Lord." This is peculiar phrasing for a military code. Who would speak in such terms amid the fervor of a crusade? Here, the narrative begins to shift from verifiable fact into the more ambiguous realm of interpretation. Some posit this language as devotional poetry. Others contend it constitutes evidence of a dual mission, one visible to the world and another communicated only in hushed, discreet tones. The rule focuses obsessively on humility, silence, vigilance, and ritual purity. Even meals were consumed in near silence, with scripture read aloud in place of casual conversation. Their armor was not merely fashioned, it was consecrated. Prior to every battle, the knights confessed, not for external appearances, but for internal preparedness. Yet, this same rule contains numerous veiled allusions to combat that is not physical, but spiritual. The adversary is frequently characterized not as the Saracen, but as pride, lust, and temptation. Their swords were not merely steel, they were extensions of divine discipline, a discipline so stringent it verged on mystical penance. This opens the door to a rare but compelling theory, that the Templar rule functioned less as a military document and more as a clandestine spiritual program, a form of warrior's gospel disguised within monastic vestments. This theory gains credence upon examining the rule's intense preoccupation with secrecy. Silence was not merely encouraged, it was rigorously enforced. Speaking out of turn, particularly concerning spiritual matters, incurred severe penalties. The deeper teachings, it appears, were not for general dissemination. Only those capable of bearing the weight in silence were permitted to grasp them fully. Here is an obscure detail that modern readers frequently overlook. The rule directly incorporates language from early monastic desert traditions, especially those of the Egyptian anchorites. These hermits retreated into the desolate wilderness to confront internal adversaries in solitude. Does this sound familiar? The Templars were not constructing churches, they were embodying them. And this comparison is not hyperbolic. In both their architectural designs and their daily practices, they mirrored the Desert Fathers. Solitude, chastity, wakefulness, and warfare, yes, but as a crucible for purification, not merely a profession. In their own words, they lived between the cross and the sword, a domain not of political maneuvering, but of personal salvation. Yet, scholars continue to debate whether this was deliberate theology or merely moral embellishment for individuals with extensive bloodshed on their hands. Was the rule genuinely spiritual, or was it a balm for guilt, a means to sanctify the act of killing? This question remains unresolved because the Templar rule evolved. Over time, new clauses were incorporated, frequently possessing deeper spiritual implications. By the late 12th century, it had expanded to over 600 articles, many of which had no direct relevance to warfare whatsoever. Entire sections addressed dreams, temptations, fasting, and even the handling of relics. This was not an order merely preserving legal statutes, it was preserving a profound vision. And here is where the earlier connection becomes apparent. Recall the preceding concept that the brotherhood was forged through internal purification. The rule, then, functions as the manual for that transformation. Every line impels the knight not towards conquest, but towards a form of crucifixion, not literal death, but the demise of the ego. One was not to eat unless genuinely hungry, not to speak unless addressed, not to pursue glory in victory, nor to lament in defeat. The objective was to dissolve into devotion. The modern mind frequently resists this notion. To dissolve into what? A cause, a code. However, for the Templars, this represented the pathway to spiritual power. The more of oneself that was consumed, the greater the space created for divine presence. Naturally, critics point out that such intensity can foster extremism, and they are not mistaken. The demarcation between asceticism and fanaticism is exceedingly fine. Yet, the rule itself appears cognizant of this. It never glorifies hatred, nor does it advocate for conquest. It speaks solely of obedience, humility, and something both vague and immense, the triumph of the soul. Thus, the rule endures, not as a mere historical curiosity, but as a mirror, a document that inevitably reflects the disposition of the reader. If one approaches it seeking control, it appears as an edifice of law. If one seeks solace, it may feel like an incarceration. However, if one comes broken, wounded, and yearning for a faith that demands everything while offering nothing in return but an inner fire, it resonates as a homecoming. The Temple Mount was no ordinary location. Even in the 12th century, it resonated with profound myth. For Jews, it represented the site of Solomon's Temple, where the Holy of Holies once enshrined the Ark of the Covenant. To Muslims, it was the revered plateau from which Muhammad ascended into heaven, and for the newly established Knights Templar, it transcended a mere headquarters. It was a threshold, a liminal space, a place where the divine once touched the mundane, leaving behind indelible whispers. The documented facts concerning such a significant location are surprisingly sparse. We know that the Templars were granted quarters atop the mount by King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. We also know they remained there for years, engaged in excavation, prayer, and disappearing into the subterranean levels. What remains unknown, and what has fueled centuries of conjecture, is what they were seeking, or perhaps what they ultimately discovered. One fragment from a 13th century chronicler in Provence recounts a Templar knight who returned from Jerusalem speaking of visions experienced by torchlight within the subterranean chambers, where the ground wept blood and the air did not breathe. Predictably, scholars dismiss this as either a product of medieval dramatic embellishment or post-traumatic hallucination. Yet, let us momentarily consider the possibility that something profound did occur beneath those ancient stones, not an artifact or a treasure, but an experience. Among the more unusual historical records are references to a handful of knights who departed the order shortly after their tenure at the Temple Mount, citing a sickness of the spirit. One reportedly retreated to a Cistercian monastery and maintained silence for the remainder of his life. Another entered a state of voluntary madness, a medieval term for individuals who wandered aimlessly, their eyes wide, muttering prayers that seemed to belong to no known liturgy. Coincidence, perhaps? Or the consequence of exposure to something not intended for human comprehension? Nevertheless, not all accounts are so grim. A controversial manuscript preserved in the Vatican archives, the Times Collectio Benedictina Asterisk, though long suppressed yet catalogued, contains a page from a Templar diary. It reads, "We entered at dusk. What we found was not made of wood or gold. It was light. It sang. We were unmade in its presence and remade in silence." This is not the language of an inventory list. It is the testimony of awe. Of course, many historians vehemently object, arguing that the Templars were practical men, not mystics, and that these tales are exaggerated fabrications born of centuries of myth-making. But if they were so pragmatic, why did they spend so many years beneath the mount, far beyond any discernible logistical necessity? Why did they refuse to document their findings? And why did they depart the site imbued with a spiritual gravitas they had never possessed before? Here is an undisputed historical fact. Following their years at the Temple Mount, the Templars began to undergo a transformation. Their rituals became more intricate, their hierarchy more insular. New regulations were introduced concerning secrecy, symbolic vestments, and the handling of sacred objects. Moreover, they began to speak more frequently, albeit cautiously, of an inner war, not merely a battle against external adversaries, but an internal darkness, a shadow each man had to confront in solitude. This shift coincides with another obscure but fascinating report, the so-called Midnight Circles. These were nocturnal gatherings, held exclusively for the most trusted knights, often in subterranean chapels. There are fleeting references to chants in an ancient, forgotten tongue, and to a symbol, not the cross, but a seven-pointed star etched into the floor where they stood. No official record confirms this, yet multiple independent testimonies from inquisitorial trials, centuries later, mention the same distinct shape, the same specific hour, and the same profound silence. Did the Templars experience something visionary beneath the mount, a literal encounter, a metaphysical awakening? Or were they simply overwhelmed by the profound significance of standing where countless prayers had once ascended and subsequently broken under the immense spiritual burden? There is an ongoing scholarly debate regarding whether the Templars practiced a form of Christian mysticism that is now lost. Some contend they were exposed to Sufi concepts during their time in the Holy Land, absorbing ideas of inner illumination and sacred unity. Others suggest they merely reflected the heightened spirituality of the era due to their proximity to holy conflict. But here is where the earlier observation softly glows from what we have already explored. Their rule had prepared them for purity, silence, and obedience. Their brotherhood had forged them into vessels. So when the visions came, if they indeed did, the men were prepared not to record, not to interpret, but to embody. What they experienced beneath the mount may have been incomprehensible. Thus, instead of communicating it to the world, they themselves became the message. Consider the curious absence of relic transfers from their headquarters. Other crusading orders meticulously collected and distributed relics, bones of saints, fragments of the cross, locks of holy hair. But from the Templars, almost nothing. It is as if they believed the true relic was not an object to be displayed, but something to be carried within. And that leads to a question no historian has definitively answered. Why did the Church, decades later, grow apprehensive of them? Why were they branded heretics, accused of clandestine rituals, forbidden prayers, and bizarre visions? Was it solely about power and wealth? Or was it fear of a knowledge the order had refused to share, a truth too disruptive, too uncontrollable? One knight reportedly confessed under duress, "We saw a light, and it asked us nothing. It only burned away the lies." That statement does not constitute heresy. It represents revelation. And if true, it was not the Templars who deviated from the Church, but the Church that diverged from whatever profound truth the Templars had witnessed. Thus, the Temple Mount transcends a mere headquarters. It becomes the crucible of their transformation. What they entered as men of flesh, they exited as something transmuted. Not angels, not demons, but simply men who could no longer perceive the world in the same manner. You stand on a hillside, the wind piercing your robes, observing men kneeling in armor. They are not before a king, nor a general, but before a wooden altar bearing nothing more than a solitary candle and a chipped chalice. These are Templars, about to enter battle, yet they are not supplicating for victory. They are praying for the sanction to die. This profound contradiction runs deep. How can an individual be both a monk and a warrior? How can the gospel, with its tenets of peace and mercy, coexist with the clamor of steel and the screams of warfare? The Church itself grappled with this dilemma, issuing papal bulls to legitimize the Crusades as a sacred obligation. Nevertheless, the Templars did not await Rome's resolution. They had already reached their own conclusion. Their gospel was not passive. It was honed, armored, and carried at their side. The historical record unequivocally demonstrates that Templars fought with extraordinary ferocity. They served as shock troops, frequently deployed on the front lines. They took vows of obedience, not merely to their superiors, but to the very moment when commanded to charge. They charged, even if it portended certain death. And yet, unlike mercenaries or feudal knights, they claimed no spoils, made no boasts, and rarely spoke of their battles afterward. The act of taking a life was never glorified. It was endured, and this inherent dissonance is where the mystery originates. One obscure passage in a lesser-known commentary attributed to William of Tyre describes the Templars as those who bled not for empire, but for example. What form of example entails the use of a blade? Some believe the answer lies in how the Templars interpreted Scripture, not as a source of comfort, but as a manual for purification. In their perspective, Christ was not solely the sacrificial lamb. He was the ultimate warrior. His suffering was not weakness, but a strategic act. This concept is profoundly disquieting. It suggests that the Templars viewed themselves not as soldiers contending for territory, but as instruments of divine retribution. Their battles were theatrical rituals of cosmic justice, enacted in real time. If sin had corrupted the world, then perhaps only sacred violence could restore equilibrium. This interpretation verges on heresy for many theologians, but for the Templars, it may have represented profound clarity. The rule, which we have previously examined, reinforces this perspective. It does not advocate for vengeance, it teaches detachment. One was not to strike out of hatred, but because the world's sin necessitated bloodshed. Whether one's own or another's, it was inconsequential, provided the act was consecrated. Yet, even within the order, dissenters existed. A minor commander named Godfrey de Santo, reportedly troubled by the cries of dying men, once penned a personal letter. "I carry the sword, but my hand shakes. If this be God's justice, then let him strike, not I." This letter was never circulated, but it remains preserved in a Flemish archive, a rare fissure in the armor of strict obedience. Scholars today debate the theological foundation of what some term crusade mysticism. Was it an invented doctrine to provide solace to killers, or a genuine spiritual response to the pervasive violence of the world? The Templars never articulated a comprehensive theology. They embodied one. Their convictions were expressed through practice, not through written texts. One fascinating and frequently overlooked artifact supports this. A hiltless sword recovered from a Templar site in southern France, etched with the Latin phrase, times non nobis domine, times not to us, Lord. The sword possesses no crossguard, no embellishment. It is almost ceremonial in its stark simplicity. If its purpose was to impress, it failed. However, if it was intended to convey the surrender of individual identity, to reduce the knight to nothing but a vessel, it succeeded brilliantly. Here, the earlier observation recurs like a faint chime. Beneath the temple mount, we discerned transformation. Within the rule, we witnessed discipline. Now, on the battlefield, we observe synthesis, an inner gospel enacted amidst mud and blood. This gospel does not convert through rhetoric, it converts through sacrifice. One monk, observing the Templars depart from Antioch, in 1149 wrote, "They do not march, they proceed as if bound for judgment. Their faces are calm, as if they walk not to kill, but to be known." The phrasing is peculiar, is it not? To be known as if the combat itself were a confession. And thus, we arrive at the precipice of another inquiry. If the Templars believed in a gospel of the sword, whom were they truly confronting? Islam, heresy, or something far more intimate? Their own fear, their own skepticism? There is a theory, rarely published, that the Templars were not battling an external foe, but the enemy within. Each skirmish, each charge, each death constituted a form of spiritual purgation, not for others, but for themselves. If this holds true, then the order was not merely a military force or a monastic anomaly. It was a confessional without walls, and every sword strike was a prayer. It is a brutal notion, yet for those who had witnessed the horrors of war and could no longer articulate prayers with words, perhaps it was the sole remaining option. They stood barefoot in the cold, their weapons set aside, their heads bowed not as soldiers, but as supplicants. The Templar initiation ceremony, despite its profound secrecy and the centuries of rumors that enveloped it, commenced not with glory, but with complete surrender. The candidate was led into a small, dimly lit chamber. There were no grand halls, no banners, merely silence, and the soft creak of floorboards beneath robed feet. Before him stood the master, flanked by senior knights. Questions were posed, simple yet penetrating. Was he free of debt? Was he married? Did he comprehend that once the oath was taken there would be no retraction? That his body would no longer belong to him, and his soul, well, that was to be forged in battle, devotion, and silence. This much is known from surviving accounts, particularly the depositions recorded during the 14th century trials. However, what transpired during the rites conducted behind closed doors remains a nebulous blend of contradiction, controversy, and profound spiritual symbolism. Officially, the ritual was straightforward, a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, followed by the presentation of the white mantle bearing the red cross. Yet, repeatedly, under interrogation and torture, former Templars recounted darker practices, kisses placed on unusual parts of the body, oaths sworn in the name of unnamed forces, and even the denial of Christ. These accounts are fragmented, often inconsistent and heavily influenced by fear. Nevertheless, patterns emerge: specific phrases, certain gestures, and one recurring element: fire. One knight claimed that the initiate was shown a flame and instructed, "This is the light of truth, and you must walk through it." Another stated that the ceremony concluded with the extinguishing of all torches, plunging the room into darkness, so that the brother would know the world he left behind. Modern scholars generally concur that many of the more sensational claims were fabricated, products of torture or rumor. Yet, even in their denials, the Templars acknowledged symbolic rituals. The obscurity was deliberate. Initiates were meant to feel not triumphant, but emptied. Their former life was stripped away, and something new was etched into the void that remained. One obscure but compelling detail appears in the Times Chronicon Anglicanum Asterisk, a 13th century English chronicle. It describes a Templar novice spending an entire night in a crypt, chained to the floor, reciting psalms until dawn. Whether this was widespread practice or the invention of a zealous prior is unknown, but it echoes a common pattern: initiation through ordeal, isolation, and a controlled symbolic death. This concept of death and rebirth is not unique to the Templars. It was employed by ancient mystery religions and early Christian monastic orders. However, in the Templar context, it gained new intensity. The vows were permanent, the discipline absolute. A man who joined did not merely enlist, he was transformed. Or at least, that was the profound intention. This leads to the ongoing debate that continues to reverberate through seminar rooms and dusty libraries. Were these initiations mystical in purpose, or merely rigorous social conditioning? One school of thought argues that the Templars were crafting not merely warriors but vessels, men capable of channeling divine justice, purified through ritual suffering. Others insist this is romanticized misconception, and that the order simply required unwavering loyalty. The rituals, then, were nothing more than a psychological gauntlet. But if strict obedience was the sole objective, why the profound secrecy? Why the emphasis on symbolic acts that appear to echo older spiritual traditions not entirely aligned with Rome? If public obedience was the only goal, why not perform these rites openly? Here, the connection to earlier concepts becomes undeniable. We have already observed how the Templars regarded the Temple Mount not as a fortress, but as a spiritual gateway. We have seen how their rule elevated discipline to devotion. Now, through their initiations, we perceive how these convictions were ingrained into the very being of each new knight, not merely through command, but through ritualistic fire. Even the oath itself, sparse as our knowledge of it is, proves revealing. I give myself to the temple to live and to die without name, without claim, without fear. This does not sound like the declaration of a mercenary. It resonates more with a monk being led to his tomb. An intriguing relic housed in the Musée de Cluny in Paris, a plain and unadorned ring, is purported to have belonged to a Templar knight. Etched inside in rudimentary Latin are the words "non sum meus," meaning "I am not my own." Whether the ring is authentic or not, the sentiment precisely aligns with the ethos described in trial records. The initiate was to disappear, only the order remained. And yet, not all initiations concluded favorably. A little-known case, buried in the Vatican archives, recounts a knight who fled the ceremony midway, screaming that the walls were bleeding. Whether this was madness, drug-induced hallucination, or metaphor, the incident was recorded and sealed. No punishment, no follow-up, just silence, as if the event itself was too sacred or too perilous to revisit. So, what were these men truly swearing allegiance? To God, the Church, the Temple, or to something only whispered in candlelight? A conviction that through obedience, suffering, and sacrifice, the soul could be reforged. The full details of the rite may never be known, but the consequences speak volumes. Those who emerged from the ceremony were transformed harsher, colder, as if they had passed through fire and emerged as tempered metal. They bore no insignia of rank, rarely spoke of themselves, and moved through the world like living relics, somehow already interred. The charges descended in torrents, initially whispered, then vehemently proclaimed, ultimately etched into the flesh of the condemned, sodomy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, denial of Christ. It was 1307, and the Templars, once the armored pride of the Church, were now its declared heretics. Arrested en masse across France, they were stripped, shackled, and paraded through the courts of kings and inquisitors alike. The public recoiled in horror. Yet, in the shadows, a more profound question burned. Were the Templars genuinely heretics, or were they concealing a gospel that the Church feared too intensely to acknowledge? Officially, the accusations were staggering. Dozens of knights confessed to strange rites, grotesque rituals, and blasphemous initiations. However, nearly all those confessions were extracted under severe torture. Feet crushed, teeth extracted, bones broken. Even then, many recanted as soon as they regained their breath. One knight, Pierre d'Aulnay, simply stated, "I said what they asked because I was in agony, but my soul never left the cross." His testimony, like most, was dismissed. But let us entertain a deeper possibility. Suppose, just suppose, that within the wreckage, a kernel of truth existed not in the sensational details, but in the recurring patterns, the pervasive secrecy, and the echoes of ancient, long-buried doctrines. A few scholars have observed peculiar overlaps between the Templar trials and earlier heresies, particularly the Gnostic and Bogomil traditions' beliefs in duality, the corruption of the material world, and the possibility that Christ's divinity was misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented. Consider, for instance, the claim that the Templars worshipped a severed head, sometimes referred to as Baphomet. Most historians dismiss this as a grotesque misinterpretation, a caricature fabricated by inquisitors. However, a few rare documents refer to a head of wisdom or a vessel of knowing utilized in Templar rituals. One theory, controversial but persistent, posits that this was not a literal head, but a symbol, a repository of divine knowledge, a forbidden gospel concealed within plain ritual. Here enters a fascinating obscurity. The Times Codex Leoninus *, a 13th century manuscript discovered in a Spanish monastery, likely penned by a former Templar turned recluse. It describes the true Logos whom the Church fears, who walks among men in silence, whose kingdom is not of stone but of flame. The Church denounced the Codex as madness, yet phrases within it bear an eerie similarity to later mystical writings, especially those prescribed during the Inquisition. If the Templars had indeed stumbled upon an alternative gospel, one that did not deny Christ, but rather reframed him, it would elucidate much: the secrecy, the persecution, and the urgent necessity to maintain silence even under threat of death. And perhaps most chillingly, the ferocity with which the Church turned against them. One of the most damning pieces of evidence in this debate is also one of the least studied, the Chinon parchment, discovered in the Vatican archives in 2001. It confirms that Pope Clement V privately absolved the Templars of heresy, even as they were being publicly tried and executed. Why this duplicity? What did the Church fear more? A guilty order or an innocent one, possessing dangerous truths? Let us recall that the Templars had spent years beneath the Temple Mount. They had access to relics, scrolls, and forgotten aspects of Scripture. What if what they discovered was not material treasure, but testimony, a version of Christ not subservient to papal authority, a spirituality that required no intercessor, no tithe, no altar, but only inner fire and personal sacrifice? Such ideas were not novel. They echoed the earliest Christians, the desert hermits, and the radical ascetics. But by the 14th century, such views were anathema. The Church had consolidated its power. Authority was centralized. Mystery was considered perilous. Here, the connection to their initiations takes on new significance. Recall how the initiates were systematically dismantled, stripped of identity, and reforged. That process was not merely symbolic. it was protective. If the order possessed truths too sacred or too disruptive to articulate, then silence was not simply policy, it was salvation. Some accounts state that the knights spat on the cross as part of their initiation. Blasphemy, or a symbolic rejection of false icons, of worldly misrepresentations of divine truth. Theologians continue to debate this. Some contend the gesture was designed to test faith, a reenactment of Peter's denial. Others assert it never occurred at all. And what of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, who, as flames climbed his legs, cried out not for vengeance but for truth? "Let evil be revealed," he stated. And then he burned, not with hatred, but with something stranger, something akin to peace. So, what gospel did the Templars uphold? Not one discoverable in a Sunday pew. It possessed no chapters, no verses. It was lived, not written, suffered, not preached, a gospel etched in wounds and silence. One that proclaimed, faith is not obedience, it is fire. It does not comfort, it consumes. And if that gospel was too perilous for the world, perhaps that is why it continues to burn covertly, awaiting those with receptive minds. It is often the silences that resonate most powerfully. In the context of the Knights Templar, it is not what they promulgated, but what they safeguarded, not what they uttered, but what they adamantly refused to disclose that continues to captivate scholars, visionaries, and skeptics alike. If a written gospel, a scroll, a codex, something embodying the truth they died to preserve, ever existed, it is likely lost, or is it? The inquiry begins in the margins. Quite literally, Templar marginalia, dispersed throughout surviving texts, frequently exhibit cryptic symbols, peculiar phrasing, or stray Latin verses that do not align with the main body of the work. The Chartres manuscript, currently housed in a French archive, contains a repeated phrase in the corner of 4 consecutive pages: Lux de igni non arde, light from fire does not burn. At first glance, this appears to be poetic nonsense. However, some believe this line echoes their core conviction, that divine illumination, once attained, is not destructive but transformative. There is no singular Templar gospel, no Codex Templari enshrined in legend akin to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Instead, there are fragments. And what renders these fragments remarkable is their thematic coherence. A set of prayers discovered in a Portuguese chapel, concealed behind plaster, speaks of a king not of nations but of wounds. A letter from an English preceptor to a French commander cryptically advises, "Speak not of the silence, for the silence is what speaks." And most famously, the so-called Prayer of the Broken Shield, attributed, though unconfirmed, to Jacques de Molay himself, reads more like a psalm than a military invocation. "When I no longer carry the blade, let me carry the burden. Let the blood I do not spill become the offering. Let the silence become the voice." These fragments were not intended to inspire. They were not for public consumption. They were not even meticulously preserved. They were hidden, folded into floorboards, scribbled on the inside of belts, scratched into the backs of pews. They were not sacred texts. They were survival manuals for the soul. Here is where the narrative becomes even more intriguing. Linguists have noted that certain phrases recur across regions, languages, and decades, suggesting a hidden oral tradition underlying the visible order. One phrase, in particular, recurs: Dominus Flammi Interioris, Lord of the Inner Flame. This expression does not appear in any church-sanctioned liturgy. Yet, it surfaces in Templar graffiti in Scotland, in a Hungarian marginal note, and even carved above a well in rural Castile. Coincidence or code? One particularly obscure artifact, the Braga Codex, is maintained under controlled conditions in a monastery near Braga. It is a brief text, unsigned, damaged, and incomplete. But what remains reads like a meditation manual. It speaks of descending into the self as into a tomb, and of meeting a light so bright that it shows the bones of the spirit. Critics dismiss it as monastic poetry, but those acquainted with Templar discipline perceive it as something entirely different. the gospel they lived, not by pen, but by sword and scar. The unresolved question, of course, is whether these writings constituted the cause of their downfall or an echo of it. Did they articulate this theology to rationalize their suffering? Or did their suffering arise precisely because of this theology? The sheen on parchment, which we referenced earlier, confirmed that the Pope privately absolved them. Yet, their words remain taboo, not because they were inherently malevolent, but because they represented freedom. Freedom, after all, is the true heresy, especially spiritual freedom. If a knight could achieve salvation through ordeal and solitude, through silence and blood, then what necessity remained for confession, for hierarchy, for Rome? Thus, the connection to earlier ideas sharpens once more. From their initiations to the rule, to the visions beneath the Temple Mount, a consistent thread emerges. Everything points inward. The true gospel, if it existed, was not a doctrine to be recited, but a transformation to be undergone. It resided in fire, not ink. But then, why bother committing it to writing at all? Because sometimes, even the most silent individuals fear forgetting. A final artifact merits mention. In 1897, a farmer near Rennes-le-Château unearthed a limestone tablet while cultivating his field. It bore only one inscription in rudimentary Latin: Templum non in lapid est, templum in carnem ardet. The temple is not in stone. It burns in flesh, if authentic, and that is a significant, if the tablet may represent the closest approximation to a written creed from the Templars. Not a map, not a secret, but a profound declaration, a gospel of suffering, a church of the wound, the kind of creed one does not display on a wall, but carries within one's chest. Consequently, no, there may never be a discovered codex, no leather-bound volume secreted away in a Vatican vault. But the authentic text, the one they died to protect, was always inscribed in broken Latin, in battle scars, in whispered prayers audible only to the stars. Not for the world, but for the fallen. Not every crusade commences with a call to arms. Some begin in the quiet aftermath of war, amidst the crumbling hamlets of Christendom, where banners have long since fallen, and the sole remaining adversary to conquer is despair. While the world remembers the Templars for their formidable battlefield discipline, few recall their missions beyond the field missions, not of conquest, but of restoration, not to expand Christendom's geographical boundaries, but to preserve its fractured spiritual core. After the cessation of battles and the repose of horses, the Templars did not retreat into castles. They dispersed into the overlooked corners of Europe, places forgotten by monarchs, by bishops, sometimes even seemingly by divine providence. These were small towns decimated by plague, or where famine had extinguished hope from the eyes of the populace. It was in these locales that the Templars re-emerged, clad not in grandeur, but in resolute purpose. A well-established, yet frequently underappreciated, historical fact is that by the mid-13th century, the order maintained hundreds of commanderies across Europe. These estates functioned as training grounds, financial centers, and outposts for logistical support. However, many of these also operated as what might now be termed spiritual shelters, places where the wounded, both physically and spiritually, were received, nourished, clothed, and, notably, educated. The order had developed its own internal system of instruction, extending beyond mere combat training. Ancient records from commanderies in Burgundy and Aragon mention literacy instruction, scriptural reading, and agricultural training. Some even reference musical liturgy hymns, sung not in Latin, but in the local vernacular, enabling the disheartened to participate. This was not a campaign of religious imposition. It was a form of spiritual triage. One obscure detail emanates from a recovered parchment in Languedoc, dated approximately 1254. It records the arrival of a Knight of the Flame who spent 6 weeks ministering to a leper colony without once drawing a blade. He provided sustenance, performed burial rites, and were said to have carved crosses into the walls of the dying men's chambers not as symbols of death, but of transition. The document refers to him as Frater Ignotus, the unknown brother. It is believed he never divulged his name. Why would a military order dispatch its elite members to serve the diseased and destitute? The answer, perhaps, lies not in strategy, but in theology, not Roman theology, but something older, quieter, a whisper of that same hidden gospel we glimpsed through their rites and rituals, a conviction that the true adversary was not the infidel, but despair itself, that the soul, when abandoned, becomes the most perilous battlefield of all. And the earlier observation resonates again, soft but persistent. The Templars' rule demanded absolute discipline. Their initiations required the obliteration of the individual self. Their silence in the face of pain was not mere stoicism, it was profound devotion. When they entered the lives of the broken, they did not offer hope through words, they embodied hope through their presence. Modern scholars struggle to reconcile this facet of their legacy. Were they warriors burdened by a guilty conscience, or saints in armor? Some argue these charitable missions were public relations, a means to counterbalance bloodshed with public good. However, this explanation fails to account for the consistent pattern, the sheer scale, and the uniformity across nations and decades. This was not theater, it was doctrine. A theory, still subject to debate, suggests the Templars viewed themselves as intermediaries between divine justice and human frailty, that their silence transcended mere discipline. It constituted a liturgical stance. By uttering nothing, they absorbed everything, pain, sin, fear, all assimilated and transmuted through suffering into a higher form of grace, a profound, almost dark alchemy. Furthermore, in Scotland, a chapel once operated by the order bears no inscription, no altar, and no pews. Yet, carved into its stone archway is the phrase, Audi non dicta, here the words not spoken. Local tradition asserts that Templars would sit there with those in mourning and remain silent, simply sitting, as if mere presence possessed inherent power, as if in their wordless gospel, stillness constituted the sermon. This unarmed ministry often went unnoticed and undocumented, yet traces endure. A worn wooden staff with 7 notches, discovered in a German cellar, is believed to have been used in healing rituals. A plain white garment, stained with wine and ash, folded inside a clay urn in Portugal. A rosary crafted from iron nails. None of these are relics in the traditional sense, yet each one pulsates with implication. Who were these men who healed without names, served without status, and left no sermon but the subtle imprint of their shadow? Perhaps by then, they had come to understand that the conflict was never truly for land or doctrine. It was for those who had surrendered hope, and their armor served not merely to confront external adversaries, but to safeguard a fragile light within themselves and within others. Thus, the crusade persisted even after the wars concluded, a silent one, a gentle one, waged not with swords, but with open hands, against despair, against silence, against the fear that no one would intervene. But someone did. The fire was real. It licked their robes, seared their skin, and silenced their voices, yet it never consumed their true essence. On the 18th of March 1314, Jacques de Molay, the final Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood upon a pyre constructed not to purify, but to suppress. As the flames ascended, he neither pleaded, nor trembled, nor uttered curses. Instead, he invoked justice. Not vengeance, but justice. His concluding words were not of power nor of pity, but of truth. God knows who is wrong and has sinned. Soon misfortune will befall those who have condemned us, and then he perished in the flames. History records the fire, but it frequently neglects its resonance. By the early 14th century, the Templars had become too affluent, too independent, and too reticent for the comfort of monarchs. Philip IV of France, deeply indebted to the order, found in their secrecy a convenient scapegoat. Heresy became the formal accusation. treason, the insidious whisper, and, like a match igniting dry parchment, the machinery of persecution was set into motion. It is a well-documented fact that hundreds of Templars were arrested across France on the same day, the 13th of October, 1307, a Friday the 13th. Coincidence, perhaps, but panic spread rapidly. Property was seized, priories were raided, brothers were interrogated, dozens were tortured, a few confessed, most resisted, and some, including de Molay, endured years in prison before facing the flames. Yet, something peculiar transpired during those years of captivity. The order, despite being dispersed and shattered, never fractured internally. Many of those who confessed under duress later recanted, not solely out of guilt, but out of defiance. One knight in Poitiers reportedly retracted his confession by biting off his own tongue, thus preventing himself from being forced to speak again. Barbaric, certainly, but also a testament to unwavering resolve. What kind of loyalty survives such dissolution? What kind of faith endures when all reward is stripped away? This is not the loyalty of soldiers, it is something else entirely. A vow that did not depend on written text or mere survival. A vow embedded in silence. The same silence we have followed since the Temple Mount, since the oaths, since the unarticulated gospel. An obscure account in a Venetian ledger from 1311 describes 3 former Templars, exiled and destitute, who continued to observe their rituals in secret, praying at dawn, eating in silence, refusing to utter the names of those who had betrayed them. They wore no cross, they possessed no banner, but they still knelt before the same inner flame, not broken, merely concealed. And then there is the enigma of the missing fleet. A frequently cited, but hotly contested, claim asserts that days before the mass arrests, a fleet of Templar ships vanished from the port of La Rochelle. Their destination, if they ever existed, remains unknown. Some suggest they sailed to Scotland, others to Portugal. A few whisper of Nova Scotia, centuries ahead of its time. These theories remain speculative, yet the disappearance, noted in multiple documents, remains unresolved, as if some within the order had foreseen the impending conflagration and sailed towards something colder, quieter, beyond the reach of kings. De Molay's final declaration, uttered as the flames consumed him, is often regarded as prophecy. Within months, both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV were deceased. Coincidence, perhaps, but the timing transformed his death into legend. Martyrdom was not the conclusion of the Templars, it was their transfiguration. The connection to earlier themes is now unmistakable. From silence to ritual, to battle to healing, the order had consistently operated beneath the surface, flowing like a hidden river through the fissures of power. The fire did not obliterate them, it revealed them. It burned away the myths, the wealth, the reputation, leaving behind only the fundamental question, what were they truly? And more urgently, why did they remain faithful even in their dying moments? One theory, inscribed in a late 14th century Carmelite commentary, suggests that the Templars believed themselves to be already deceased, that their initiation had been a burial, their service a resurrection. The flesh we walk in is borrowed, the commentary reads, and the breath we speak with is not ours. So let the world take back what it thinks it owns. The vow remains, to burn alive and still believe. That is not doctrine, that is conviction, and it is profoundly unsettling because it implies their inner fire was not kindled by human hands, it was carried within them. It is often asserted that silence possesses a discernible form, and if one listens with sufficient attentiveness in certain forgotten chapels, ruined cloisters, or moss-covered crypts, that silence resonates. It resonates within the stone, in carvings whose meanings were never explicitly articulated, but only experienced. In geometric patterns cut with a precision too profound to be merely ornamental, in floor plans that mirror celestial constellations. If the Templars were truly silenced, the very walls did not receive the message. Long after their arrests, long after their supposed obliteration, The Order's presence endures in architecture, not through overt grandeur, but through recurring patterns. Churches shaped like octagons with no offered explanation. Knights carved on tombs with crossed legs, not as a symbol of death, but of a journey. Spiral staircases that ascend counterclockwise, as if to unravel the soul. One widely accepted historical fact is that following the dissolution of the Order, many Templars were absorbed into other knightly organizations, particularly in Portugal. King Dinis, refusing to participate in the persecution, established the Order of Christ, a conveniently rebranded continuation of Templar operations. Their headquarters, the Convent of Christ in Tomar, evokes a peculiar sensation upon entry into its chapel. Not wrong, but layered. Above the altar, angels and martyrs gaze down. Yet, concealed within the stone ribs of the dome, faint symbols repeat. A star, a flame, a pair of closed eyes. Symbols never referenced in the official liturgy, yet they appear again and again. This is where the theory of encoded architecture takes root. According to a minority of architectural historians, the Templars embedded spiritual diagrams within their buildings, maps not of territory, but of transformation. Consider the Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. Although its direct link to the Templars remains debated, its carvings follow unmistakable Templar motifs. The twin riders, the concealed cross, and an altar oriented not toward Jerusalem, but toward the rising sun on the vernal equinox. The builders of Rosslyn left no blueprints, yet within its arches and beams, some discern a cosmology, a journey from darkness into light, a veritable cathedral of initiation in stone. Others argue the evidence is circumstantial, contending that Gothic architecture inherently invited complexity. But the cumulative connections become increasingly difficult to disregard. We have traced the inner gospel, the silence, the fire, the transformation. If the Templars could no longer articulate it aloud, perhaps they carved it instead. In southern France, a ruined chapel near Montaillou bears a single Latin phrase above its threshold: Mortem transivit qui templum intravit. Death is passed over by those who enter the temple. Was this a metaphor or an encoded promise? Blood, too, left its traces. In Scotland, where many believe the Order sought refuge, gravestones of suspected Templars bear markings inconsistent with traditional Christian burials. The cross is often flanked by abstract flames, or what some term the breath spiral, a motif also found in Coptic Christian iconography and even older desert monastic art. Perhaps coincidence, or perhaps continuity. One obscure manuscript in the Archives Nationales of Paris, catalogued anonymously, contains a list of rural waypoints marked only by numbers and initials. Beside each, refugium, ignis, aqua, manus, lux, refuge, fire, water, hand, light. Scholars hypothesize it may have been a coded route, not for escape, but for pilgrimage, a physical reenactment of the soul's journey encoded within landscapes, as if certain fields, wells, and stones themselves had been sanctified through suffering. This raises an open question. Could the Templars have created a kind of spiritual map across Europe, a network of stations for those still seeking the silence long after the Order itself was reduced to ash? This is what some modern seekers believe. Pilgrims traverse these supposed Templar paths not to discover relics, but to find resonance. They touch the stone and wait. And sometimes, they report feeling something, a humming, a warmth, or simply a moment of stillness where everything seems to align more profoundly. Are these traces real? Science offers no definitive answer, but meaning does not necessitate empirical evidence. It requires only echo, and so, through stone and blood, the Order endured, not in armies, not in dogma, but in pattern, in silence, and in the spaces they left behind, spaces that do not explain, but merely invite. Centuries after the smoke dissipated and the ashes cooled, the Knights Templar continue their march, not in armor, but in collective memory, not through sacred lands, but through the human heart. Their name, long buried under accusations and fire, has re-emerged in peculiar and and quiet places. One observes it in modern oaths taken by clandestine societies, in the solemn vows of spiritual seekers, and even in fringe Christian sects that profess to revive the old way, a path of silent suffering and inner fire. But why? Why, in an era of scientific reason and pervasive digital noise, are people once again listening for the whispers of the Templars? The historical record indicates that by the 18th and 19th centuries, fraternal orders across Europe began to invoke the Templar legacy, some with genuine reverence, others with theatrical flair. Freemasonry is the most prominent example, particularly the York and Scottish rites, both of which incorporate Templar titles and rituals. However, even more obscure groups emerged quietly, repeating phrases and symbols once believed lost to the flames. One of the most intriguing examples originates from a spiritual revival movement in rural Germany during the early 1800s. A sect, referring to themselves as the Sons of the Silent Flame, conducted nocturnal processions through forests, carrying unmarked banners and chanting in Old Latin. Their texts, only partially recovered, refer to a brotherhood of ash and speak of an inward blaze that no hand may quench. When interrogated by authorities, they asserted no affiliation with Rome, only with those who burned but were not consumed. Skeptics contend that this resurgence constitutes romanticized fiction, that the Templar image, filtered through novels, legends, and occasional blockbuster films, simply attracts the spiritually curious. And indeed, the Hollywood version, with its secret vaults, coded bloodlines, and maps etched in stone and prophecy, undoubtedly contributes to its appeal. These narratives sell books, not salvation. Yet, beyond the mythos, something more profound beckons, and it is not merely spectacle, it is structure. Individuals are drawn to the Templars, not for their violence, but for their profound vows. In a fractured world, the concept of a code silent, sacred, absolute, exerts a powerful magnetism. The allure lies not in swords, but in stillness. One particularly fascinating modern revival group, the Times Fraternitas Templatis *, operates discreetly across 3 continents. Members wear plain garments, devoid of insignia. Their gatherings are characterized by communal silence, shared bread, and something termed the light ritual, where participants sit around a single flame for hours, offering no words, only presence. Their guiding principle, non sum meus, I am not my own, sounds remarkably familiar. Their founder, now deceased, left behind a solitary statement explaining his purpose: "We do not seek to rebuild the order, we seek to rebuild the wound it tried to heal." Here, the connection cycles back through centuries, the silence of the initiation, the fire of the gospel, the healing in forgotten towns, all of it breathes anew through modern seekers. They do not carry the Templar name with arrogance, they carry it with profound longing. Nevertheless, not all who invoke the order do so reverently. Extremist groups, fringe conspiracists, and ideologues have also attempted to co-opt the Templar image, typically stripped of context and polished into a symbol of martial glory or religious supremacy. The cross once again becomes a weapon, the vow becomes a mere slogan. This misappropriation represents a distortion, not a resurrection, but those with discerning understanding perceive a deeper truth.